this computer. Okay, lovely. Right, here we go. So thank you very much for everybody coming this morning. Really appreciate it. So as I said, my name's David Billington. I'm an independent funeral director for Full Circle Funerals. And today we're going to talk about funeral choices and what's available in terms of the choices out there today around funerals. And we're going to discuss a little bit around the restrictions to do with the COVID pandemic as well, because that has changed the way that funerals operate from a day to day. And we'll go through that a little bit later on. So the sort of four main questions that we're going to go through today is, can funerals really help? What does a funeral director do? Funeral options in general. And then we're going to talk a little bit at the end just around funeral plans and funeral wishes. So we're just going to start with the question, can funerals really help? And in my opinion, the short answer to this is yes, they definitely can. And they can help in lots of different ways. Being able to have that kind of ritual to say goodbye to someone, to mark the loss in your life, however people choose to engage in that, I think is really important. And it's different for everybody. Some people, as part of that ritual, they want it to be something really kind of large and ostentatious and have lots of people attend and have that, I suppose, group sense of loss come together so you can share that experience. And for other people, that's not something that they want. They feel like they want something that's a little bit more private. And to give you an example of that, we had a family a couple of years ago come to us, and they had described a kind of previous experience of a funeral that they had, and they said that it just left them feeling empty, and they'd gone down the kind of traditional path of going to a crematorium. And so once we discussed a few different options with them, what these guys decided that they wanted to do and felt like was going to be meaningful for them was, all they did was come into our service in Guiseley. They used our meeting room, and there was 5 people that attended, and they brought a photograph album, a bottle of their mum's favourite whiskey, and a plate of Marks and Spencer sandwiches. And they just spent a couple of hours talking about their mum and just looking through pictures and just remembering about the person that had died. And they didn't kind of have speeches. They didn't follow this traditional format of having someone sorry, that's my dog Wilson in the background, if you can hear anyone whining. They didn't kind of have this eulogy or anything like that. They just wanted a place to be able to share in the memories of their mum. And for other people, that's not going to fit, and they want something that is, I suppose, a lot more of a kind of group sense of loss. And we've definitely helped a lot of people in that at the same time. But having this event to mark the loss of somebody, I feel from the previous experiences that I've had with lots of different families now, is really, really helpful and kind of sets that tone of what everyone can do from that point forward in terms of sharing each other's experiences of what they've had with that person when they were alive, and really, I suppose, having a good start to their grieving process and being able to look back on that painful point and think, it's not all negative, and they've got some positive memories that actually are associated with that time in their life. And everybody can contribute to this in different ways. And for some people, they might want to contribute in some kind of spoken word format by delivering a eulogy. For other people, it might be a little bit more creative in terms of flower arranging, or it might be something like actually getting a cardboard coffin and everybody coming and writing a message on that, or creating some sort of picture on there. But having that, I suppose, way of engaging, it just means you aren't a passive member of the audience that doesn't actually have any bearing on the event itself. You are engaging in it and hopefully coming away with something that you look back on in a positive light. So what does a funeral director do? So very practically, a funeral director looks after the person that's died. Right from the start. So after that person's died, whether they are in a kind of residential nursing home, in a private residential home, or in a hospital or a hospice, we will bring them into our care and onto our premises. And then from that point onwards, we'll discuss with the family about how they would want the care for that person to happen. And we believe that's really an important part of the process. We don't just want to assume that every single family wants somebody cared for in exactly the same way. We want to be able to discuss different options with them, which I'll go through in a little bit more detail later on, and then actually give them an opportunity to consent to what's going to happen, and also to give them the opportunity to be involved if they want to be as well, which we have done on multiple occasions through the past few years, and we know it can be really powerful. Another thing that's a very important part of the funeral director role that we feel is that we're essentially like a library of information when it comes to bereavement, death, dying, and kind of funeral choices. And we want to be a conduit for that information. We don't want to be somebody that's pushing our views on somebody else. So we want to be able to kind of give across this information in a format which is going to be digestible for that family and not overload them, which I think is quite key, because there is a lot of choices these days, and there is a lot of opportunity to be able to create something special and meaningful, but it can also be quite confusing because there is tons of different options. And especially if you're going through a bereavement, you're probably not quite as astute as you normally would be in terms of your decision making. And so being able to give people the time to process this is really, really important. And some of the families that we've worked with over the past few years, we've been having meetings with them, and we've kind of recognized that we've gotten to a point where we feel like we may be overloading them with information. So we've given them the option and said, do you want to stop the meeting and restart it again in a couple of days, or tomorrow, or even later on that day? And quite a few families have said yes. And I've always found that quite helpful. And I know from feedback from the families, they have too, because it's given them that time and space to be able to really digest the different options that are out there and then make decisions which are going to fit them best. Because the last thing that we want for anybody is for them to come into an arrangement and then feel like that they've left making decisions which they're going to regret, because we only get one chance at creating a funeral, and being able to do that in a way which you want to be able to look back on and think, yes, that is really something that was meaningful to me and I've made the right decisions, is super important. Another thing that we think is very important as funeral directors is creating a space that is very, I suppose, isn't a closed door atmosphere. As soon as people come in, we want them to feel like they're in a space which is they're comfortable, isn't kind of oppressive in terms of its decor. We want them to feel friendly in an inviting environment. And if they have any questions or if they want to discuss anything, then it's a place where they feel completely at ease to kind of ask those. And whatever they need in terms of their own grieving process, we're able to facilitate that for them, whatever it might be. We essentially do everything but the words on the day. So we kind of get involved in every aspect. So it could be that we help with the catering, we help with creating the kind of wake venue. If you're having a service in a different location, we'll organise that with the venue itself. Transport on the day, the funeral gets involved in every kind of point of contact. And we don't normally speak on the day. As I said, it's normally done by a minister or a celebrant or another officiant, or sometimes even the family. But we have actually done the words as well at some point, because I am a celebrant, so I've done quite a few services in the past. And we do have an ex-minister that works for us as well. So we do have that option, but generally it's mostly done by outside professionals. So when it comes to locations and the kind of flow of how a funeral service works, I think there's a preconception at the moment that funerals have to happen either in a church or in a crematorium, and they have to be all on one day, and it needs to happen in a certain order. And that is just couldn't be further from the truth. We've had funerals in people's houses, we've done funerals in village halls, in hotels, we've done funerals outside, we've done funerals even in our services within Guiseley and Bramley. With the COVID pandemic as well, we even had to get a bit more creative, as I'm sure quite a few people on this call have had to as well, and do them digitally recently, because the crematoriums at one point during lockdown just closed their doors and didn't allow the public actually onto their premises. So then we had to move to a format which we felt was going to be helpful to people, and a format like this through Zoom really did help. And we had multiple services where we had celebrants were leading services, in a more traditional style format, so still had an introduction, pieces of music played, even slideshows in some cases, with a eulogy from family members or from the officiant themselves, but it was just all done in a digital format. But having the options to do this in kind of lots of different locations, I think is something that more people hopefully will get to know over the next few years, and will feel empowered to kind of make those decisions for themselves. Because I know from personal experience, when we have done funerals in other locations, it just takes that time pressure away. Because in crematoriums, you generally have 20 minutes to be able to do a full service. And 20 minutes, let's face it, is not a lot of time to kind of remember someone's entire life. And so if you are choosing to use a different location, it just gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of what you can create, and how you can kind of put across that person's life. And not to kind of downplay the crematoriums, because there are some beautiful ones across the country, and you are able to get longer service times if you pay for that. You can book double slots if you want to, and lots of people do, to kind of take away that pressure of having almost the conveyor belt feeling that some people describe, of having a family waiting to come in after you've finishing your service. But just knowing that there is options out there definitely helps a lot of people. In terms of the kind of flow of the service as well, some people go for a traditional format where you would have your introductions, pieces of music, eulogy, and then towards the end there's what's called the committal. And the committal is essentially where that person is either laid to rest in the ground if they're being buried, or they are sort of passed on into the council's care to be cremated at a later time. And that kind of area of the service normally includes phrases like ashes to ashes, dust to dust, or some other kind of secular descriptions of that. But there's no reason why that committal needs to be at the end. And so we talk to people about what is the most important parts of the service and how would they like that to be configured. And there's lots of families that have chosen to have the committal even on separate days, especially when it comes to burials and cremations. You don't need to do it all on one day. And so there's some families that will choose to have quite a private committal where there'll only be certain members of the family or friendship group invited. And then at a later date, they'll have a sort of bigger service where lots more people can be involved. And just having that flexibility can really help. I suppose lots more people get engaged in a meaningful way, because I think for some people, they feel a pressure for everyone to attend on one day. And unfortunately, especially during the current climate, it's not actually possible when it comes to travel restrictions. So doing things over multiple days can be quite helpful for people. So as I mentioned before, the kind of words of the service, so this could be the eulogy, it could be poems, it could be readings. These can be really significant parts of the service for a lot of people involved. And getting this right is a really important part of the kind of funeral ceremony. And I know there's some people on this call today that do it quite often and do it very well, because we've worked with you before on multiple occasions. It doesn't have to be a religious leader. There's lots of kind of secular officiates that are out there. You've got what's called a civil celebrant, which is somebody that kind of sits between no religion and very religious services, and they would offer something that kind of hedges all bets, I suppose, and they can include a little bit of religion, but they generally wouldn't do very heavily religious services. Then you have what's called a humanist celebrant, and a humanist celebrant is somebody who would focus more on the person that has died and doesn't include religion within their services. Friends and family can obviously do all of the speaking parts themselves. We've had quite a lot of services in the past where they've been completely led by friends and family, and I think that can be really powerful. But it's not for everybody, because some people really struggle to get their words out on the day. And so having somebody to kind of almost create that structure and be a bit of be someone that's a bit of a backup. So even if someone wants to speak, but then goes up and actually thinks, no, I can't get my words out, having somebody there to be able to speak on their behalf can be really helpful. And then, of course, you don't even have to have any words if you don't want to. We had a funeral a couple of months ago in Harrogate, where they just chose to have 4 pieces of music back to back. And one of those pieces of music was bird song. And everyone just within that period just kind of listened to this bird song, and it reminded them of a place where they all used to go when they were younger. So there's lots of different ways of being able to create a service, but the words tend to be one of the kind of focal points. So these are the different areas that people use most of the time. When it comes to coffins, there are a multitude of different options. There's lots and lots of different types of materials that range from kind of your wood veneers, which is like an MDF base with a wooden veneer wrapped around. And these probably tend to be one of the more popular options that people go to. They're quite a traditional format. That's the picture in the top left. Then you would go to things like solid wood coffins, which are much kind of sturdier and heavier, and these tend to be used a lot of the time for burials. And then there's materials like wool, wicker, cardboard. You can even get what's called a shroud, which is the picture in the bottom right, if everyone can see that. And shrouds are a different type of coffin, I suppose. They are still allowed to be used in cremation and burial, but you can see the kind of shroud cover there. But if that's taken away, you would actually be able to see the shape of the person under that. And we've used quite a few of these in natural burials through the years. But in terms of coffins, there are hundreds of different choices. There's some coffins as well these days where you can even create your own images to be able to wrap around the coffin, and so you can kind of completely bespoke that to make it as individual as you like. And I'll show a couple of examples a little bit later on that one. So other items that you might want to consider are things like flowers, and if they're important to you as a family in terms of your funeral arrangements. And this can be done in a multitude of different ways. There's obviously florists that would provide fresh flowers. A lot of families have chosen to use flowers from their own gardens in the past, and so it's a little bit more meaningful for them. And people have done their own arrangements rather than engaging a florist themselves, or they've done it as a group of people and come in and kind of have that experience as a group. So sometimes it's a good way of getting children involved as well. I know that Sarah's done quite a few arrangements in the past where the families have chosen to bring the kind of the grandkids in, and everybody does it together as a kind of group experience. But alongside the fresh flowers, there is also options to have something which is longer lasting, because for some people, they don't find any value in having fresh flowers because let's face it, they don't last a long time after the funeral because they need to be in bloom on the day. So they generally only last a couple of days to a week after the funeral's taken place. And that can also impact on people's grieving processes. So it's something to consider about having either semi-permanent designs, which we work with a lady just based outside of York called Pippa Designs. And she does some lovely different semi-permanent wreaths of all different kind of shapes and sizes. And you can also get faux flowers as well. There's quite a few companies out there that will provide faux flowers for funerals, and it's more of a rental cost rather than you actually buying them. But if you did want to buy them, there is that option too. When it comes to vehicles, there are, again, lots of different options out there. We personally have a few different types. So we've got our traditional fleet, which is kind of what you would normally expect to see on a funeral. So like a traditional limousine along with a traditional hearse. We also have our eco fleet. So for anyone that wants to have a bit more of an environmental angle to the funeral, if you can see the picture in the bottom right, that's our eco hearse. So this is based off a Nissan Leaf. I think there's only 5 of these in existence, and we are very lucky to have one of them. And it's a fully electric hearse. And as you can see, it's a lot smaller, it's a bit gentler. And so we found these have been quite popular on funerals of young people because it looks a bit more modern, and for people that are going for more kind of the natural burial angle because it fits quite well with making less of an impact on the environment and reducing your carbon footprint. But saying that, over the years, I've been surprised about the amount of people that have chosen to use this in a traditional funeral setting. And we've had quite a lot of families that once they've known that this was an option, have decided to go for this because they prefer not to have such an ostentatious entrance. And they want it to be a little bit more gentle. And so quite a few people have liked to use the eco hearse. But in terms of vehicles, there is multiple options, which I'm sure some of you are aware of. Things like using horse-drawn carriages. You can get vintage cars now, like Morris Minors. I think there's even kind of Jaguar race cars, which have been converted into hearses as well. There's lots and lots of different options out there. Things like motorcycle hearses as well are quite popular. One of the things related to vehicles that we find can be quite poignant is the route that's taken on the way to the funeral service. And this can happen in lots of different ways. Sometimes it might be that the family just wants to meet you there, and that's absolutely fine. And for other people, they want to have a few kind of important points that they pass at, or maybe an important place that they start at. So a conversation that we always find quite helpful is, where do you want to meet and what do you want to do on the way there? And we've had people kind of go to places like the Cow and Calf in Ilkley because that was a really important part of their life, and they just want to stop there for a second as a mark of respect. We've had other people say, could you drive past Ben's favourite pub, because he was down there every Sunday and he'd love it if he would drive past there one more time. Or certain people have said, oh, could you go past the bookies on the corner, because he was there every Thursday to put a bet on the horse races. There's all sorts of different places, but just giving that option to be able to kind of make that part of the ceremony can be quite powerful, because the ceremony doesn't need to start at the point that everybody walks into the kind of funeral service venue. And I think that's something that we're really quite keen to impress on people, is that the whole of this process is important. So all of the conversations that you're having previously, the lead up to the funeral, who kind of engages in the legal side of it, which parts of the funeral are important to different people, and how do you want everybody to engage? And the more that we can, I suppose, engage a wider group of people to get involved within the funeral process, the better, because it means that they've had a part of that experience rather than them being this passive observer. But another thing that's also can be quite important is just refreshments in general. Now, at the moment, this is a little bit limited because of what's happening with COVID, because there's a restriction on which venues are even open and which venues are allowing people in. The venues that are open, it seems to be that 30 people is the maximum amount of people that are able to go. But there's no reason why we've kind of extended this into more of a digital thing. If you did have a lot of people wanting to come to a funeral, you could still have a venue which allows this, put a TV up in the corner, we could set up something to do with Zoom, and then you could have people kind of enjoying their refreshments at home. And there's various different caterers that will deliver refreshments. So we could always have a kind of digital version of a wake alongside something that's going on physically at the same time. And I think being able to have these kind of creative outlets is really important, especially during the time that we're in at the moment. So just to go back to personalization a little bit, I touched on this a few minutes ago, but as I said, in terms of coffins, there's just a whole wealth of choices. As you can see from the picture, just on the top right there, this was a funeral that I did a couple of years ago, and I'm sure the gentleman that arranged this won't mind me discussing, because he was very keen that everybody knew that this was possible. His partner was a really keen cyclist, as you can see, and it was just a massive part of her life. And so within this funeral, they wanted that to be represented in quite a few different ways. So everyone coming to the funeral had to come on a bike. So as we were driving down from the family house to the church in the hearse, we just had this like 200-300 cyclists following us basically on the way down. The coffin itself was really bespoke. So this is all the Tour de Yorkshire pictures. And then on top is her club colours. So she was part of Otley Cycling Club. And then there's some details around her name there as well. On the bottom, you can see just a box of chocolates. So this was somebody's favourite chocolates. And there's lots of different ways of doing this. Some people go for kind of things like seed packets. If they were a gardener, and you can bespoke those seed packets to say whatever you want on them, as well as put pictures and kind of details of where to plant them and when to plant them for those that aren't as green fingered. But there's so many different ways of being able to kind of create these personal touches, and just again make it something deliberately personal, and make it something that people are going to remember and look back on fondly and think that was really nice and that really represented Nikki's personality. So as far as post-ritual funerals go, we believe that this, again, is just as important as the rest of the process. This isn't something that's an add-on and should be kind of viewed as, oh, we'll get to it at some point. This can be a really, really important part for certain people in the funeral. And we know in the past that people have, this has almost been the focal point rather than the funeral service itself. They've kind of had that section, and it may have been very kind of lots of people attending, but this private part of either scattering the ashes or maybe burying them, or some people put them out to sea, it is really important. And there's lots of different ways of being able to create this post-funeral rituals now. I mean, I've been talking to a few people recently that have come up with really creative ideas. I was talking to a lady yesterday who is she's a graphical artist, and she's recently started doing paintings, but with ashes involved. And so she'll do memorial paintings, sometimes portraits of the person, other times it might be a scene or some sort of templated graphic, but then actually put the ash inside. So it's not actually very obvious that this is a memorial painting. It's something that people can keep in the house and be a lovely piece of art, but for those in the know, it's got a lot more meaning to them. And that's not for everybody. Some people want to go for something a little bit more traditional, and maybe once the ashes have been created, they're put into an urn and maybe kept on their mantelpiece and kept in some sort of very nice kind of bespoke piece of ceramic. For other people, they want to be able to have a place which isn't sort of on view every day, but they can visit when they want to. And so for those people, a lot of people choose to scatter in a certain place around the country. Some people choose to bury the ashes in a very specific part that they can visit when they want to, and even attach headstones to this, which you can do, or put plaques within certain cemeteries. And for other people, they want to have multiple places to visit, because there's multiple different people in that person's life that may live really far geographically away from each other. And so being able to have different options for people to visit can be quite helpful. And so we've helped families split ashes into various different kind of sections before, so they could take part of one person to Devon, let's say, another part of a person across to America, and then another part might have been made into like memorial jewelry. Because there's various companies now that will allow you to be able to create things like rings and pendants, and have something on your person that is made from the ashes of that person. You can even have diamonds created these days from hair and from ash. Another option that people seem to be finding quite liking, is quite popular recently, is taking handprints or fingerprints of the person. And the reason that you might do this is there's multiple different options out there. For some families, they choose to have, again, bespoke pieces of jewelry made for them. So you could have cufflinks or necklaces or earrings. For other people, they want like a specific piece of art made from that handprint or the fingerprint. And there's even companies out there now that will create tattoos from the fingerprints as well. And you can even have your tattooed fingerprint on with the ash of the person implanted into the tattoo ink. So you've got kind of a bit of a double whammy going on. But I realize that these are very specific options, so it's not going to fit everybody, but it's about showing people what's available and then figuring out what's going to be best for them, but giving them the time to process this. So if we just take a step back to slightly further back in the presentation, just around what a funeral director actually does. I just want to talk a little bit about the care of the person who's died. So one of the first things that we want people to consider is, after somebody's died, where is that person going to be kept? Are they going to be in a funeral home, or are they going to be in some sort of central hub? Because each type of funeral director acts a little bit differently. For example, we have a mortuary on each site in each of our locations. So when we get a phone call from a family and we're talking about bringing someone into our care, we say to them, which location would suit you best? Because some families kind of live in between different locations, and just because somebody lives, let's say, in Guiseley, it might be that they actually want that person to be cared for in Harrogate because their closest and dearest friends and family members actually live in Harrogate rather than in Guiseley. So we never want to assume, well, where somebody wants to be cared for. So we identify that as soon on as we can within that process. Other funeral directors have similar setups, and other ones operate completely differently, and they'll have what's referred to more as a central hub. So within this central hub, it might hold sort of 200 to 300 people, and it caters for 10 to 15 different branches of that funeral director's business. And so we always encourage people to kind of ask these questions from the outset, so they find the service which is going to suit them and their family best. Once that person does come into our care, when there's an appropriate time, we want to have an open discussion and sit down with the family about how we are going to care for that person. And as I said before, get informed consent for everything that we are going to do in terms of care. And this could range from things like washing and dressing the person to more invasive procedures like embalming in very specific cases, or something as simple as somebody coming in and putting hand cream on the person. There's no kind of right or wrong when it comes to caring for somebody that's died. There's certain things that we might suggest in certain situations if somebody's coming to visit quite often, to make sure that their experience is going to be as positive for them as possible. But there's never anything that needs to be done. And I just want to stress that it's all about choice when it comes to caring for somebody that's died. And there's quite a lot of families in the past that have chosen to do no care whatsoever. And that's absolutely fine, because from kind of their, I suppose their words, they've said that they were messed about with enough in life and they don't want anything else happening to them after they've died. And I completely get that. And as I mentioned before, very briefly, giving the family a chance to be involved can be really meaningful for some people. And for those people, I've seen it happen quite a few times. It's always a difficult process because not many people have been through this before. But once they do go through it, and while they're going through it, you can see that it is very cathartic for them. There's one family that I'm thinking of that they were, it was a mother and daughter that had lost their husband/dad. And they'd been the carers for this gentleman for almost 2 years and had done pretty much everything for him in the house. And once we sort of offered out the opportunity to do this final piece of care, they jumped at it because they didn't like the thought of strangers effectively doing this care for them. And I completely understand that. If it was the same situation for my father, I wouldn't want somebody else doing something. I'd want to do it for him. And we realise it isn't for everybody, but we want to offer this option out to people just in case it is something that is going to be beneficial for them. So that leads quite nicely into visiting. And so as you can see down the bottom, there's 3 pictures of just examples of our visiting room. And we wanted to make this space as kind of light and inviting and as possible, and kind of leave it as a bit of a blank canvas. So if somebody does want to come in and kind of add their own pieces to personalize the room, then they're more than welcome to. And we've got options to be able to play music as well. And we'll kind of talk to people about what they want this experience to be like. And for a lot of people, I don't think they realize that they can kind of personalize this. It might be from a prior experience that they've had that wasn't particularly well executed, or it might be just things that have been passed on by other family members and friends, and they don't realize that they have choice and power over this situation. And so one of the things that we initially talk to people about if they are coming to visit is how do they want that person to be presented. And what I mean by that is that a lot of people assume that somebody has to be in a coffin when you go to see them, and that's just not the case. There's lots of different ways that you can go and spend some time with somebody. And one of the other options is you could have somebody, instead of in a coffin, they are on in a more bed style arrangement. So they look essentially like they're in a comfier place, because seeing somebody in a coffin can be quite a striking image. And for a lot of people, that is something that they want. And it's something that they're going to, I suppose, gain closure around, and it's something that is going to be helpful to them. But for others, they're just not quite ready to have that. And it might be during the visiting process that they actually decide that they want to see the person in the coffin, which we've had a few times. People have started off in this kind of more bed style arrangement, and then during that couple of weeks or even longer, they've decided to come and visit again, but they've asked for them to be in the coffin. And for some families, I've had some arrangements where some people have chosen to see that person in a bed style arrangement, but then other people in the same family have said, I don't want to see them in that. That doesn't seem right to me. I want to see them in their coffin. So we've transferred that person depending on who is coming to see them. So we're kind of creating an environment which is going to be suitable for them. And another thing that we think is really important is helping people make that transition into the room as smoothly as possible and preparing them for it. So before they go in, we're not just going to kind of shove them in and go, here you go, spend some time. We want to talk to them about what it's going to feel like in the room, what the temperature might be like, what the temperature of the person might be like, because I think a lot of people are surprised at how cold a dead person's body is, and being able to kind of have these conversations openly has been very helpful, I know, to a lot of the families that we've worked with. And it just sparks off questions from them as well about what the person might look like. And especially if somebody has been in something more of a kind of tragic circumstance in terms of their death, things like road traffic accidents or anything where there's had to be involvement from the coroner, sometimes they might not look as they did in life. And so being able to prepare people for that, we feel, is really, really important. So to come to the end of the presentation, I just wanted to talk a little bit about funeral wishes and funeral plans. So to start with funeral wishes, this is a document which I'm not sure everybody's aware of, but we've found really helpful for lots of different people over the past few years. And it gives someone the opportunity to be able to kind of write down all of the more personal details around what they would want in terms of their own funeral. And some people have really gone to town on this and gone through tons and tons and tons of detail. And for other people, they've kept it quite sparse. So there's been certain areas that they've concentrated on more than others, because as they've been going through the kind of prompts, we've got a document that we can send out if anyone's interested. They've seen that certain parts are more important to them than others. Just to give you an example of a few of the choices, it could be things like very practical options of what coffin you want, where you would like to be cremated or buried, who you might like to be your celebrant or minister, or to the more kind of emotional side of things of what sort of tone do you want to the funeral? Do you want it to be a really happy event? Do you want it to be something that's a bit more somber? Or do you want there to be a certain type of care that's happened to you before you are cremated or buried? And who would you like that care to be completed by? And just kind of giving people the opportunity to be able to explore this, we found to be extremely helpful, not only for us as funeral directors, but also to the families that are creating these funerals after the person's died. Because 9 times out of 10, unfortunately, we find when people come to arrange funerals, they've had no prior conversations about what that person wanted. And so they're having to make essentially their best guesses. And in some families, this can cause quite a bit of friction, as I'm sure quite a few of you have experienced before, because certain people feel very strongly on certain ideas and they want to incorporate that into the funeral. And so if you are able to kind of leave these example plans for people, it just helps to make that whole process much more positive for everybody that's involved. But the level of detail that's involved is completely up to the person that's creating it. For some people, as I said, they write reams and reams, and it's almost like an essay. And then for other people, it's very sparse in terms of the information that's given. But once you have done this, if you do choose to do it, I would suggest giving it to either a very close family member or to your solicitor, or you could even pass it to your funeral director, or keep multiple copies with people. And you can always update it as time goes on. It's not as if once the document's written, that's it, it's set in stone. This is something that could be a working document. And we've had quite a few families that are still adding to their funeral wishes now, and they've been kind of slowly creating them over the past few years. So it's not something that needs to be done all in one chunk. And so what can you do, I suppose, to help with what we've been talking about today? Because we really believe that having conversations like this is going to be very helpful for everybody, and it will remove that kind of taboo around the conversation of death. And so what I would suggest doing is having a chat with people about your own thoughts and what you would like from a funeral, and trying to open up that conversation, or maybe talking about the kind of more funeral plan side of things, if that's what's important to you, and having some sort of financial plan put in place. Because I think the more that people talk about this, sorry, my dog's whinging. The more that people talk about this, the easier it's going to be for everybody when the time comes, because unfortunately this does happen to everybody at some point in their life. And so the more that people are prepared, the better it's going to be for everybody in general. And I think it will also help to create higher expectations within the industry, because one of the things that we are quite conscious of at the moment is that people do have very low expectations of what a funeral is. And so I think the more that people are engaging in these conversations and showing that they do want something which is more personal and interactive and engaging, then the industry as a whole will have to react and start to improve all of their standards across the board. Well, thank you very much for listening, everybody. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm also going to stop the recording.